Welcome everyone to the event. I'm so excited to have you all here tonight. My name is Abby Simmons. I am a member of the public engagement team at the Art Museum, and we're so excited to welcome you to the Allentown Art Museum's week-long virtual MLK celebration. Tonight's dynamic conversation is called Unsung Suffragists, Leaders of Color in the Fight for the Vote. We'll begin with a brief overview of New Century, New Woman, the exhibition that inspired this panel, followed by presentations from each of our esteemed panelists. At the end of the program, we have time for questions and answers, so please post your questions as they come to you in the comments or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many as possible later on in the event. Without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful moderator and panelists. I'll start with Claire McGree, our moderator tonight. Claire McGree is the Assistant Curator at the Allentown Art Museum and the curator of the new exhibition, New Century, New Woman. She received her MA from the Bard Graduate Center in Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture, where she received the Horowitz Foundation for the Arts Award for her thesis, The Debutante Slouch, Fashion and the Female Body in the United States, 1912 to 1925. Her areas of specialty include clothing and textiles, and the social history of gender, especially as it relates to posture, movement, and the body. Thanks for being with us tonight, Claire.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Kathleen Cahill. Dr. Kathleen Cahill is a social historian who explores the everyday experiences of ordinary people, primarily women. She focuses on women's working and political lives, asking how identities such as race, nationality, class, and age have shaped them. She is also interested in the connections generated by women's movements for work, play, and politics, as well as how mapping those movements reveal women, especially women of color, in surprising and unexpected places. She received her PhD at the University of Chicago, and she taught at the University of New Mexico for 13 years before moving to Penn State, where she is now an associate professor of history. She is the author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, and Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. Cahill serves as the steering committee chair for the Coalition of Western Women's History. Thanks for being with us tonight, Dr. Cahill. Next, we have Dr. Sharon Harley. Dr. Sharon Harley is an associate professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. She and historian Rosalind Terborg Penn co-edited and contributed essays in the pioneering anthology, The Afro-American Woman, Struggles and Images. She edited and contributed to two anthologies, Sister Circle, Black Women in Work, and Women's Labor in the Global Economy, Speaking in Multiple Voices, resulting from two major Ford Foundation grants. Among her many published articles, she has written about the world's leading suffragists in Race, Women, Cultural Productions, and Radical Labor Politics, and Mary Church Terrell, Gentile Militant. She recently published African American Women and the Right to Vote in Women in Suffrage, 2018, and I Don't Pay Those Borders No Mind at All, Audley E. Moore, Queen and Mother Moore, Grassroots Global Traveler and Activist, Reframing Black Nationalist Pan-Africanist Engagement in Women and Migrations. She has held fellowships at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, as well as the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University's Hutchins Center and the National Humanities Center at the Research Triangle, North Carolina. In 2010, she was awarded the Carter G. Woodson Medallion for Outstanding Scholarship. Dr. Harley has delivered papers at professional history and women's conferences in the U.S., as well as scholarly meetings in South Korea, Ireland, France, Spain, Italy, Ghana, South Africa, Abu Dhabi, and China. Harley is the principal investigator of a recently awarded Mellon Foundation grant to the University of Maryland for a 2-year African Black Diaspora Research Seminar. Harley served as principal investigator of a Ford Foundation seminar, Women of Color and Work Research Seminar from 2002 to 2006, and was co-editor and contributor to The Afro-American Woman, Struggles and Images, co-editor and contributor to Women in Africa and the African Diaspora, and editor and contributor to Women's Labor in the Global Economy, Speaking in Multiple Voices. Thank you for being with us tonight, Dr. Harley. And last but not least, we have Dr. Vicki Ruiz. Dr. Vicki Ruiz is a distinguished professor emerita of history and Chicano Latino studies at the University of California, Irvine. A first-generation college-bound student, she received her PhD in history from Stanford University in 1982. An award-winning scholar and educator, she is the author of Cannery Women, Cannery Lives, and From Out of the Shadows, Mexican Women in 20th Century America, and co-author of Created Equal, A History of the United States. She and Virginia Sanchez Carroll co-edited the 3-volume Latinas in the United States, A Historical Encyclopedia, which received a 2007 Best in Reference Award from the New York Public Library. Over the course of her career, Ruiz has participated in numerous public history and community engagement programs, including Arizona State's Hispanic Mother-Daughter Program. From 2007 to 2012, she served as Dean of the School of Humanities at UC Irvine. In 2012, Professor Ruiz was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Directing 27 dissertations, she has mentored 4 generations of graduate students from UC Davis, Claremont Graduate School, Arizona State, and UC Irvine. The National Women's History Project named her a 2015 honoree in recognition of her scholarship and her research. Ruiz has also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Association and the OAH Rosenzweig Award for Distinguished Service. She is past president of the Organization for American Historians and the American Historical Association. On September 10, 2015, President Barack Obama awarded Vicki L. Ruiz the National Humanities Medal. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Ruiz. We're so honored to have you here.
It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Well, without any further holdups, I'll pass it off to Claire to do an introduction of the exhibition, and then we'll move on into presentations. Please don't forget to post your questions at any time that you have them throughout the program, either in the Q&A section or in the chat.
Thanks, Abby. I'm so excited to be here this evening and to have a chance to introduce the exhibition New Century, New Woman. This exhibition focuses on social change for women during the era 1890 to 1920 through the lens of fashion. The New Woman was a term in this era used for women who challenged traditional gender roles. They wanted to expand beyond the roles of mother and homemaker to explore new public opportunities such as higher education, careers, and the right to vote. The first section of the exhibition looks at how femininity was expressed in clothing during this era. As you can see from these examples, women's clothing was highly decorated using materials like plush velvet, gleaming silk satin and lace, and had a highly feminine silhouette that had an exaggerated full bust line and small waist. This hyper-feminine look certainly fit into traditional ideas about women being delicate, submissive, and ornamental. However, it wasn't in opposition to some of the changes that the New Woman was fighting for. Some women used a fashionable feminine appearance as a tool while challenging and subverting norms with their behavior. On the other hand, women also embraced new practical additions to their wardrobe inspired by menswear during this era. The shirtwaist blouse was inspired by men's collared shirts and was one of the first separates clothing items to enter many women's wardrobes. This popular fashion staple became an iconic outfit associated with the New Woman, both because of its novelty and the way that it plays with gender norms. Shirtwaists were appropriate for working women, either on the factory floor or in the office. They could be a practical option for women who were exercising, and they were also worn by the increasing number of women who were going to college in this era, as you can see in the image at right. The exhibition also includes a selection of lingerie dresses. These white day dresses had were very fashionable and had a very delicate feminine aesthetic, similar to the garments we saw in the first section of the exhibition. This example here has white, delicate floral embroidery, lace insertion where the fabric of the dress is cut out from under the lace to create a diaphanous look, and pin tucks that create detail and shaping at the waist and hip line. The color white was appropriated by the British and American suffragist movements, and they staged their marches in white suits, shirtwaist outfits, and even lingerie dresses. In this way, they were able to play with the traditional associations of the color white with modesty and femininity, as well as the lingerie dress as this ideal, fashionable Edwardian femininity, and use this to advance their cause. Initially, historians identified the new woman as a white middle-class phenomenon, but in recent decades, scholars have challenged this, examining the experiences of women across class and race and acknowledging the important contributions these women have made. I've been especially excited in the last year to see the increasing awareness of the role of women of color in the fight for the right to vote. These women probably weren't included in your history class, but absolutely deserve more attention. Tonight, we're lucky enough to have with us scholars who are doing the important work to research and share the legacy of these leaders. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ruiz and invite her to take the floor.
Okay, well, I want to talk about two women. One is a suffragist and the other is someone who built upon her legacy. In New Mexico, Aralina Otero Warren and Conchortisi Pino campaigned for political office in 1922 and 1936, respectively. Now, both women belonged to a landed gentry for whom a, quote, Spanish heritage was rooted in a sense of place and privilege. They were part of 26 Hispano families who were part of the 26 Hispano families. That's Concha, and if we could talk about Aralina first. Okay, there. Part of 26 Hispano families that dominated the New Mexico legislature. So these were women who were probably more upper middle class in economic status, but in New Mexico, they were considered very elite. Both advocated for women's issues, albeit with marked differences. Aralina Otero Warren was an avowed feminist, a friend of Alice Paul, the National Women's Party, devoted suffragist, whereas in my interview with her, Conchortisi or Pino bristled at the term feminist. In fact, she said she preferred the term feminine to explain her advocacy for civic duty, sort of very much tinged with noblesse oblige. Now, Aralina Otero Warren ran as a Republican candidate for the US House of Representatives in 1922, the first woman from New Mexico and the first Hispana to run for national office. Maria Aralina Isabel Emilia Nina Otero Warren was born in 1891, again, a member of a prominent political family. In fact, her second cousin, Miguel Otero, served as the territorial governor from 1890 to 1906. She was well educated in Santa Fe and St. Louis, and she ventured to New York City for a stint of settlement house work, very much imbued in progressive era. Though ostensibly to her family, she had gone to New York City to care for her brother, who was in medical school at Columbia. Now, from 1915 to 1920, the strong-willed independent Hispana proved a tireless crusader for women's suffrage. As she wrote Alice Paul, "I will take a stand and a firm one whenever necessary, for I'm with you now and always." Paul in turn credited Otero's splendid leadership as an influential state lobbyist in securing New Mexico's ratification of the 19th Amendment. She had become according to her biographer, Charlotte Whaley, she had become somewhat of a celebrity, a local celebrity. And she was elected to the Santa Fe as a superintendent for Santa Fe schools in 1918. And she decided to run for Congress. Winning the Republican primary, she proved an astute politician, penning press releases that detailed her reform record on education, temperance, and social welfare. She was a charismatic campaigner who spoke of her political ideals and also her connection as a native daughter of the land. And in fact, in one speech, she referred to my people founded this state. And by my people, she meant sort of the whole Hispano community. And her Democratic opponent was a fairly newly arrived European-American attorney by the name of John Morrow. And in fact, she might have used my people to really distinguish herself from Morrow. Reporters focused not only on her gender, but her noble Spanish heritage. And in reflecting on the intertwined politics of whiteness and respectability among Hispanos is what historian John Nieto Phillips has detailed so brilliantly in his book, The Language of Blood. One journalist went so far as to attribute her red hair and freckles to her German Visigoth ancestors, who centuries before had settled in Spain. I'm not kidding. Historian Elizabeth Salas offers cogent insight into this Hispano worldview that whitewashed colonial mestizo settlers into Españoles. Quote, during the 1930s, Spanish was the polite term, a marker of class distinction in contrast to the term Mexican. Furthermore, New Mexicans continued to embrace a Spanish identity, one rooted in a pioneer past, separate from later Mexican immigrants. Now, she ran on a gubernatorial, on her congressional campaign. She said she ran on a reputation, she was honest, that she had integrity, and she believed in fair play. But late in the campaign, her cousin, Miguel Otero, publicly revealed that she had lied about her personal life. She was not the widow of Ross and Warren, but instead a divorcee. Indeed, she lost by less than 10,000 votes. And several historians have contended that it was this sort of last minute reveal that sunk her candidacy. She never again ran for elected office, but still she was a power in educational reform and in the arts and crafts, in the Hispano arts and crafts movement. She was a early vocal critic of off-reservation Native American border schools, and she was also an advocate for bilingual education. Also, there was another reason I believe that she did not run again for elected office. During the early 30s, she and the love of her life, Mamie Meters, settled on a homestead north of Santa Fe, building two adjoining adobe homes. Now, at the same time that Otero Warren is very involved in the Hispano arts and craft movement, there's a newcomer that burst on the scene, Conchortisi Pino. And she defies, and she continues to defy any archetype of Latina political activism. In 1936, at the age of 26, Maria Concepcion Conchortisi Pino became the first Spanish-speaking woman, and at the time, the youngest person ever elected to a state legislature. During her 6 years as a representative from Santa Fe County, newspapers frequently depicted her as a glamour girl. She had tons of fan mail. People were always sending her candy and flowers. And she even had in her scrapbook a fan letter from Clark Gable, inviting her to Hollywood for a screen test. But on the legislative floor, she proved a conscientious, shrewd legislature. With confidence, style, and an occasional tart tongue, she served as majority whip of the New Mexico House of Representatives, the first woman state legislature to hold that position. Again, she referred to her Spanish noble heritage, and she said she ran for office not out of a sense of social reform, but because it was expected of her because of her family. And she recalled how at Christmas, her father would always remind her of their sort of special role in New Mexican society. The idea of the many more gifts the Lord has given you. And it requires them to be generous and to oversee the welfare of their neighbors and employees. She echoed his words. You must take care of their material needs, their spiritual needs, their medical needs. Now, she came of age in a family where appearances, place, and privilege were paramount. She described her mother as very vain and that her mother's sole aim in life was to please her father. Quote, I never saw my mother without her makeup or earrings. But her father taught her that she was the one to represent after him his place in the state legislature. Although she had a brother, she said they wouldn't throw him to the wolves, they chose me. So for 10 years after school, she would go and she would watch her father as a legislator, and he would teach her the rules of the house. Now, it's 1936. She is a Republican. She changes her party conveniently to Democrat. And with her chauffeur as her chaperone, she campaigns for her seat and for FDR's reelection. However, once elected, she shows that actually she was quite at odds with reforms that are typically associated with the New Deal. She voted against ratifying an amendment prohibiting child labor, and she voted against a state law that would have regulated working hours for women in New Mexico. And she publicly proclaimed that many of the New Deal agencies did little more than provide, quote, lady bountiful social workers with jobs. However, one of her most notable accomplishments was the requiring of the teaching of Spanish in New Mexico's elementary school. Didn't matter your ethnicity, you had to take Spanish. She resigned, in fact, her membership in the influential Latino civil rights organization, the League of United Latin American Citizens, when they publicly opposed her measure. She couched her arguments for this early version of bilingual education less on notions of cultural preservation than on the good neighbor policy. Hispanos, whom she defined for me as raza, would use their dual language skills to foster Pan-American understandings as goodwill ambassadors and also to secure commercial relations. Now, although she was very hostile to the term feminist, and I was told when I was introduced to her by Rose Diaz, at the wonderful archivist at New Mexico, do not say anything about feminism. She did introduce the first bill that would allow New Mexico women to serve on juries. Her bill failed, and it wasn't until 1969 that women in New Mexico could sit in a jury box. She pushed for a civil service merit system which protect women workers at the Capitol from bosses who demanded sexual favors as a condition of employment. During our interview, she burst with pride in recounting her efforts. But the one thing I did fight for, I wanted to see the merit system. That I felt with my whole body, because I'd seen so many of the girls who had gone to work in the Capitol and ended up with babies. I'd seen men abuse girls, and I wanted the merit system. It was my dream, and it did come true. Now, I consider her sort of a situational advocate for women's rights. She departed electoral politics in 1942, but continued a life of civic and cultural engagement well into the 21st century. She took a leadership role. She was very involved in access, disability access, and she referred to herself as the mother of the ramps in Albuquerque because the way, in fact, was a part of the President Johnson's National Commission of Architectural Barriers, which led to the federal legislation in 1968 that addressed accessibility for federal buildings. Now, they're talking about fashion. They're both Aralina Otero is very much a new woman in her presentation. And Conchortisi Pino, even as a senior citizen, was very concerned about how she looked and how she presented herself. She was a part of a group of New Mexican elites that were flown by Ralph Lauren to New York for the premiere of his Santa Fe collection in the 1980s. So she shows up at the reception in a simple black dress. And she said all these other sort of newcomers to Santa Fe were like, in their sort of, they would have their squash blossom necklaces, a lot of Indian jewelry, like with sort of this cowgirl, cowboy gear. And someone asked her, where was her jewelry? And she looked at them and she goes, I don't need a costume. I know who I am. And that was very much. And so we have to think about, because often when we talk about Latino political activism, we think of people like Dolores Huerta or Luisa Moreno, labor leaders. And it's important also to look that there's this very solidly middle class activism among Spanish-speaking women in the United States.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ruiz. That was wonderful. I just want to remind all of our attendees this evening that you can share questions with us in the Q&A box for the end of the presentations. And I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Cahill.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be on a panel with these two amazing scholars. I'm really grateful to be here, so thank you to the Allentown Museum. I'm going to open up my PowerPoint here to share it. And I thought what I would do today is talk quite a bit about this question of fashion and how Native women used it politically. And I just want to say really briefly that I'm going to use some terms, or you might see some terms in the newspaper articles that I show, that are historic terms that are now quite problematic, but I'll put them in air quotes, and I just wanted to let you know. So as you can see from this headline here, for Native women, clothing is an important symbol of ongoing cultural traditions, and it continues to be politically important. And what I'll show you tonight is there's a long history behind this. I'm going to use my time to talk about one Native suffragist in particular, Marie Baldwin, who is a member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation, and talk about how she very strategically used style choices to make political arguments and points. But before I tell you about how she was doing that, I have to give you some background about the moment she was living in. So I'm gonna go over that really quickly, and it's a little complex. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to answer them afterwards. So Native nations are sovereign nations, right, that existed before the United States was here. And after the American Revolution, the federal government continued to acknowledge that sovereignty by entering into treaties with Native nations, right? So international agreements, bound by international law. But that really changes after the Civil War. As the US Army began to fight against Native nations and force them onto reservations, the federal government stops using those diplomatic relationships and begins to instead think about Native people as individuals who become legally classified as wards of the government. And they're not yet fit for full US citizenship. So to give you a sense, other categories of wards at this time include children, mentally ill people, prisoners, right? People who don't have the ability to make their own decisions about their lives. And white suffragists often complained that as non-voters, right, they were classed with these very people, but didn't deserve to be. You can kind of see the way in which they would juxtapose themselves, usually to men, right? And you see Native men in both of these. So, so the federal government, right, is treating Native people as legal wards, and to make these supposedly uncivilized Native people fit for US citizenship, it created a whole series of policies that historians call assimilation policy. And basically those policies were designed to destroy Indigenous communities, Indigenous political systems, and Indigenous cultures, and sort of erase them and make Native people kind of disappear into the US citizenry as kind of, melt them in, right? And it focused on three big things: land, law, and education. So breaking up reservation land, right, and communally held land, the development of boarding schools to remove Native children from their cultures and sort of educate them in particular ways, and then a series of laws that outlawed cultural practices. And once that had kind of all worked, then Native people would become US citizens. So essentially, they're dividing the reservation into individual farmsteads. They're teaching children in boarding schools how to farm and behave on those farmsteads in couples, and instituting laws that made Native cultural practices, from, for example, men wearing their hair long to religious ceremonies, kind of running the gamut, made all of those things illegal. So the federal government, you can see here, right, the kind of this photo really captures what they're trying to do. And this kind of before and after photo was pioneered by Richard Henry Pratt at the Carlisle Indian School here in Pennsylvania. It was the first federal off-reservation boarding school, founded in 1879, and it became the model for 26 other off-reservation boarding schools. And again, the picture is worth 1,000 words. The goal is to change Native people from the left to the right. And you can see that clothing plays a really large role in this. Native girls are taught to sew and to launder appropriate clothing. They're taught to raise their children to wear the right kinds of clothes. You can see that hair is part of this. how one wears their hair, both men and women. So that's happening, but at the same time, many Americans believed that real Indians looked like the woman on the left, right? But it's the same woman, but looked like the version on the left. And popular culture reinforces this, right? Wild West shows, dime novels, and later movies. And they believed that that's what real Indians looked like. And if they didn't look like that, they weren't necessarily real or authentic. And for Native women in particular, there were sort of two stereotypes. One was kind of the princess, the beautiful, noble princess. And in stories, she would usually die by the end of the story. Or what was known as the squaw drudge, which is a very derogatory term. And that was a woman who was kind of overburdened, whose husband was lazy, and she had to do all the work. So Native women who wanted to participate in political conversations kind of ran into these ideas and had a couple of dilemmas. First, many of them disagreed with the government that their cultures were bad. They saw the value in those traditions and art forms and didn't want them to be erased. But if they didn't look Indian to their white audiences, they weren't always recognized as authorities. But if they looked the part too much, then they might be seen as uncivilized and not worth listening to either, right? So let me just give you, use the story of Marie Baldwin to give you an example of how Native women navigated these perils at the turn of the century. So this is Marie Baldwin. I love this dress, and it reminds me of some of those in the exhibit. She's a member, as I said, of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation, which is now in what's the state of North Dakota. She moved to Washington, D.C. with her father, whom you see here on the left. And he was an attorney for the tribe, and the chiefs had sent him to Washington, D.C. to contest a treaty. And she goes with him as his legal clerk. And she later begins to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington. So two other things happen in Washington, D.C. She's come to fight for treaty rights, so she's already political, but two things really politicize her in the city as well. The first is she enrolls at the Washington College of Law, which is now American University's law school. It was a feminist law school founded by women for women, because most law schools didn't allow women to enroll. Though in Washington, Howard University, which is the historically Black university, did allow men and women. And the Washington College of Law did not allow African Americans to enroll. We can talk about that later. It's a hotbed of women's suffrage activism and feminism, and she becomes involved in that movement there. Also, at the same time that she's in law school and working full-time, she helps found and becomes part of the governing board of the Society of American Indians, which is a group of Native people. It's kind of similar to the NAACP. They were fighting back against stereotypes about Native people as uncivilized or savages. And for example, in 1914, the women of the Society of American Indians are talking about why the word squaw is problematic and shouldn't be used when referring to Native women. They also really emphasize, right, they push back on the idea that Native cultures are bad and should be replaced. And they in fact argue that women were treated better in a lot of the Native cultures than white women are in mainstream US culture. And they talk about matriarchal power. They point out that women had say in had political decisions, that they could own property, they had rights to their children, they could get a divorce. But these are all things that that most white women couldn't do at this time. And white suffragists are intrigued by this. So you can see the way that Native people kind of get used in these suffrage conversations, and Native women are contributing to these ideas. In 1913, the suffragists were planning a parade in Washington, D.C., the same weekend as Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And the organizers asked Marie Baldwin to create a float celebrating that traditional matriarchal power. And you can see here in this newspaper picture what they kind of wanted to see. It's a picture of her, right? The braids, the shawl. But she, and this is sort of, she looks Indian, right? But she ultimately doesn't make the float, and she instead marches with the lawyers from the Washington College of Law dressed in a cap and gown, as you see here. And this is a good example of how she was playing with clothing and image. She knew what people expected Native women to look like, and she had sat for that photo. That's her photo. But she also was playing with those expectations. What was useful when she wore the outfit on the left was that people paid attention and they invited her to do things, right? Like sit for interviews or create floats or speak at events. And then they listened when she got on stage. And a number of Native women used this strategy. One of her colleagues in the SAI, Gertrude Bonin, called this dress that she's wearing here, this buckskin dress with the beaded top, her calling card, because she knew it opened doors for her. And once she got on stage and started talking, she didn't talk about sort of the traditions of the past. She talked about what she called the Indians of today and their contemporary problems. So their lack of political power, the land loss due to federal policies, the healthcare issues they faced, especially during the flu epidemic of 1918, for example. And so here's another image of Marie Botno Baldwin that again sort of reinforces how she could play with this. Here she's celebrating Native cultures and the place of Native women in them, right? And criticizing the white culture that the government wants to assimilate her in. The government that is, by the way, her employer, right? She works for the Bureau. But she's also, right, you see with these multiple photographs of herself that she was very comfortable with all of these, that she embraced tradition, but she also embraced modernity. She used it in, let me give one more example of how she used it. During Woodrow Wilson's administration, the civil service began to require that employees submit pictures into their personnel files. And this was part of the Wilson administration's efforts to segregate the civil service and keep African Americans from getting jobs in it. So this is the picture that Marie Baldwin submits for her file, right? We again know that she had other images she could have used, but she deliberately, I think, chose the image on the left to make a point about the importance of Native culture, right? And the value of, and particularly Native women's artistic skills. And she herself was an avid collector of Native women's art. That should have been a picture of that. I don't know what happened to it. And so I'll just conclude by, just making again the point that Native women and Native suffragists and activists were really adept at using clothing to open doors and to send messages that undermine the expectations of their audiences and critique federal Indian policy. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cahill. It's so interesting to think about the multiple layers of gender and class and race intersecting there. Yeah, and so Dr. Harley, go ahead.
Well, I'm honored to be here with my distinguished panelists. I want to thank particularly Abigail and Claire for organizing the panel. My biggest challenge this evening will be to keep it within the 10-minute time frame. Even if the narrative is about unsung suffragists, it's really hard to do it in 10 minutes. So I look forward to your questions. You see here, even though we're talking about unsung women suffragists of color, I have the distinguished iconic suffragist abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And I have him here because he's often a part of that unsung narrative. That is, some people would write just about Frederick Douglass and exclude the early abolitionists and suffragists who were active in the early women's rights movement. And that would be people like Sojourner Truth, the poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And Mary Ann Shadd Cary is significant here because she was the first African-American woman to graduate from Howard Law School in 1871, and she was a journalist. So I decided I'll just talk about two, quote, unsung women suffragists, and that's Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. I select the two of them because they represent the spectrum of political and social identity and different approaches to suffrage engagement and political engagement. So this photo of Mary Church Terrell speaks to the fact that she was from a very prominent, socially elite African American family. Supposedly her father was the first Black millionaire out of Memphis, Tennessee. And so this was not a Photoshop in temporary parlance. It wasn't that she went to a photo studio and picked out this outfit, as many people had to do. This was a part of her normal attire in her wardrobe. So as the daughter of a very elite family, she would wear these kinds of clothing, and she traveled extensively, unlike Ida B. Wells, who's the other person I'm going to talk about. They have different backgrounds, different approaches, and different attitudes toward political activism. So as the daughter of a very wealthy family, she attended boarding schools, and she becomes a undergraduate at Oberlin College. At Oberlin College, we first know that she has some interest in women's rights and women's suffrage because she writes a senior paper on advocating for women's suffrage. We also know that she's a part of a new era, the new century, or what some people call the women's era, because when she graduates from Oberlin, contrary to her father's wishes, she takes a teaching position at Wilberforce University in Ohio. Her father's incensed. The argument he gives is that job should have gone to the daughter of a poor family who needed it more than she did. But I think more likely he also wanted her not to be in the public space that prominently. But she took the job anyway, and they didn't speak for about a year. And I imagine that maybe this is how wealthy people make up with their children. He then pays for her to travel around Europe to learn foreign languages for 2 years. And he accepts the fact that she wants to teach. And she said, it was a part of my duty to my race. So she is offered a job at Elm Street High School, Dunbar in Washington, D.C. It's a very distinguished institution. It's like a college prep. Everybody went on there to go to Ivy League schools and prominent schools. But she never really actually teaches at Elm Street High School because she marries the Harvard graduate Robert Terrell. And then prior to the 1930s, if you were a woman and you married, you had to give up your teaching position. Possibly their thinking was that you would then stay at home and you would cook and entertain. Well, that wasn't what Molly Terrell had in mind. She despised cooking and entertaining, and so she went on the lecture circuit. And so she traveled up and down the East Coast, lectured on behalf of women's rights, racial equality, and other temperance and the like. And this is how she's attired for that. And people were paying 25 cents to hear her lecture. And here she then decides that what she's going to do is promote women's suffrage through the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And she promotes it as a member of various women's suffrage organizations. So it's Mary Church Terrell who said in 1890 that in a comparison between Black women and white women in the suffrage arena, that white women only had to combat the obstacle of sex, but that colored women had to overcome the obstacle of gender or sex and race. And one was a much harder task. But in any case, she, unlike the next person I'm going to talk about, she's active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She's much more forgiving of the racism that she encountered in these spaces. And she attends meetings, women's suffrage meetings in Washington and internationally. And it was in 1895 that she attends a women's rights meeting in downtown DC, and Frederick Douglass is there. And it's a really turns out to be a very sad occasion. He invites her to tea. She declines the invitation. And that evening, Frederick Douglass dies. And so she, in her autobiography, regrets having said no to Frederick Douglass. And I think about that when some of my other distinguished people might invite me to something. I often think about, maybe I don't want to be like Mary Church Terrell. So if it's Skip Gates or some other friend, maybe I'll go. So in any case, she becomes president in 1896 of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And it's a premier organization of African-American women nationally. And they are very active in the suffrage movement. They have committees involved in women's suffrage. They are active as speakers in the women's suffrage movement. And the person who I'm next going to talk about was also a member of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And the next person is none other than Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida B. Wells also has Memphis connections, but she comes from certainly a much more working class or poorer family. And unfortunately, both her parents die when she's very young, and she has the task, as so many daughters in particular, of helping to raise her siblings. And she said it was a commitment she did not regret. But in any case, she becomes active, and I'm going to go back to this in a second. She becomes active as an anti-lynching crusader. And actually, Mary Church Terrell did as well, but she's not as widely known for that as was Ida B. Wells. So, we'll be marching down, well, a little bit, Pennsylvania Avenue tomorrow. But they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1913 for the Women's Suffrage Parade. And this speaks to the differences between Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. Mary Church Terrell followed the racial edict of that period. That is, the leading white women suffragists asked the African-American women to march at the rear of the parade. And while they did not want to, Mary Church Terrell and nearly all of them agreed. But Ida Wells gave them a lot of pushback, and she just walked away. And people thought it was a done deal. She was upset, but not to worry. Well, they didn't know Ida B. Wells. When the procession proceeded down Pennsylvania Avenue, the Illinois delegation passed by. She jumps out from the crowd and gets into the Illinois delegation. And people are incensed and horrified. But the newspaper reporter says, but Ida B. Wells had a grin on her face. And that speaks to the kind of person that she was, a much more militant person. And even though my article about Mary Church Terrell, I described her as a militant, I added the part, she's a genteel militant. Because Ida B. Wells did something that Mary Church Terrell wouldn't have done. And Mary Church Terrell would not have confronted Alice Paul and or Susan B. Anthony about excluding Frederick Douglass from a women's suffrage meeting scheduled for Atlanta. But Ida B. Wells did. Ida B. Wells confronted Anthony and said, how could you do that to your dear friend and the like? So those were the differences. One was a much more grassroots, much more confrontational activist. And it wasn't that Mary Church Terrell was not opposed to some of these activities. She just did it in a different kind of way. And so she would write letters to the NAACP complaining about Paul and other people. But Ida B. Wells would confront them. And Ida B. Wells then sees the women's suffrage campaign not just about women's suffrage or right, but about civil rights and about economic reform. So she connected suffrage with economic reform. She also connected suffrage with lynching. She thought if women had the right to vote, the anti-lynching crusade would be much more productive. And so we know Ida B. Wells because she was the founder of the Alpha Suffrage Club, and it was the first African-American women's suffrage club in Illinois. And here again, it wasn't just to get women to have the right to vote, it was to promote electoral politics. It was to get African-American men elected. And so it was the Alpha Suffrage Club that got Oscar DePriest in 1915 elected as the first Black alderman in Chicago. And in 1928, he's elected to the United States Congress. He's the first Black elected official since Reconstruction. And I was just, it was hard pressed for me not to connect the fact that he said he would not have won were it not for Black women's activism. I had to think about South Carolina and our incoming president and his turnaround in South Carolina. So in closing, I just want to say two things about them and how they were connected, even though they had different styles of engagement. One was much more confrontational, much more grassroots, but they were both committed suffragists. They were both committed to the anti-lynching crusade. In the last years of their life, they were active as civil rights activists. So in her 80s, Mary Church Terrell goes down to downtown DC and demonstrates against a segregated restaurant in DC. And this was 1953, 1 year before Brown versus Board of Education. And so they were two very outstanding suffragists. And I just will tell you the title of their autobiographical text that gives you some sense of what they were like and their philosophy. Mary Church Terrell's was A Colored Woman in a White World, and Ida B. Wells was Crusade for Justice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Harley and all of our panelists. There were so many inspiring women and inspiring stories shared this evening. And I just want to remind everyone in the audience that if you'd like to submit questions, we do have a few minutes left to take questions. And I have one to start us off, which is, what similarities, good or bad, do you see between these early women's movements and the contemporary social justice movements?
Oh, a great question. I already ended up by saying that I thought that the extent to which Oscar DePriest said he would have never been elected were not for the activism of African-American women. So I think that's one arena. I think people don't realize how young these women were. They were, college educated, they're college age, or they were very, very young. And I think when we see, for instance, some of the movements today, we're thinking, oh, this is the first time young women have been really involved. But that's a pattern of political engagement for a variety of reasons. And these were very militant. If you think, well, the militancy just started in the 60s or in, the 21st century, they were very militant for their period. I'd like to see what Claire is going to do with a fashion presentation around the dress, because I think the dress is quite different today.
Mhm.
Definitely. Oh, and Dr. Harley, if you're able to stop the screen share.
Let me,
Yeah.
oh yes, thank you very much.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Would anyone else like to address that question?
What? I don't think that there would be, certainly, I think Conchortisi Pino would be horrified.
Mhm.
She really was a person of her sense and place. Whereas I think Aralina Otero Warren certainly would be more sympathetic. I mean, she's someone who took more risks in her life than Ortisi.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Harley said it so, concisely, that this, right, the importance of women in sort of the fight for voting rights throughout the 20th century, right, and we have seen it more recently that remains such an important part of the struggle, and particularly women of color. And I think that kind of gets to the question that I can see from the other panelists, which is what year women got the right to vote, women of color. And so for Native women, it's complicated, right? So in 1924, the federal government sort of blanket says, okay, everybody that's not a citizen that hasn't been assimilated can become a citizen. So the Indian Citizenship Act. That's 4 years after the 19th Amendment. Right? So there were lots of Native men and women who couldn't vote. But even in 1924, a number of states passed laws that are very similar to Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, but also, do you live on a reservation? If so, you can't vote. So they're disenfranchised for much later into the 20th century. And still, right, there are still ways in which Native people living, particularly on rural reservations, are disenfranchised. So technically it's 1924, but again, it's really after the civil rights movement that you see many Native people able to vote.
And it's complicated, certainly for Mexican-American women in the Southwest. In New Mexico, they're voting. In 1940, in Texas, they are not. Unless, they have means and they are paying the poll taxes. In fact, one of the big fundraisers for the Ladies Lulette Council were like cakewalks and bake sales and fundraisers. So they could pay the poll tax so that Mexican Americans could vote in Texas. I would argue it's really not until, I would say, after World War II that Mexican American women are voting in any numbers in California. The Jones Act grants citizenship to people in Puerto Rico since 1916. But depending upon, whether or not women could exercise the franchise, depended upon where they lived. Certainly in New York, they would be able to exercise the franchise. But if they're a cane worker in Hawaii, they're not going to be able to exercise the franchise.
And we see this replicated in the South. In the South, even though African-American men had the right to vote, they were almost immediately disenfranchised. And these same regulations were used to apply to African-American women in the South. So they don't really vote in significant numbers till the 1960s. So it's people have the official right to vote, but there are all these methods, legal, illegal, extra legal, that prevent different groups of people from voting.
Yes, so one other question. Have you seen change over the course of your career in terms of how these histories of these women are being received in the historical field, or challenges in terms of having these histories taken seriously?
That's a great question.
Absolutely.
I think we're living embodiments of how much it changed. Because
exactly.
My very first book, and I dedicated all of my talks last year to Rosalind Turborg Penn, who, as graduate students, would go to conferences and there'd be nothing, absolutely nothing about Mary Church Terrell. And the sad part was that she was at the meeting that the people are talking about. So I said, well, Rosalind, maybe they didn't know. Rosalind said, no, they spoke. Mary Church spoke at these early National American Women's Suffrage meetings. So it's come a long ways. And, we've been around, at least Vicki and I have, we've been around long enough to see how it's changed. And I think that most university students, undergraduates, would be a little disappointed if some of these topics are not covered. And so we're happy to be a part of sharing this work with the larger community, but it's really, it's a good time to be in the academy. We may have some other issues, but this is certainly not only respected, and there are many books on the topic, but there's a lot of funding within foundations for the kind of work that we do.
Absolutely. And that certainly was true early on. Often the panels on women of color, there'd be like two panels and they'd be at the same time. It would be like so annoying.
And I would just add to that, I think that, this was last year now, the 100th anniversary of the suffrage centennial, and that it was you know, there's still a ways to go, but there was a lot more acknowledgement of and incorporation of the stories of women of color and diversity in a lot of ways, you know, religion and class, and trying to really tell a full story rather than one that was narrowly focused on, you know, the upper middle class white, you know, the Susan B. Anthony's, and I think it was pretty successful.
Absolutely. And your book, Recasting the Vote, it's a marvelous, marvelous book.
Thank you, Vicki, so much.
I actually have an invitation in my files from Nancy Pelosi for the 100th anniversary reception at the very Capitol Arena where, you know, last week was, you know, under siege. In any case, I don't know how I was invited. I asked another person more distinguished how she was invited. She didn't know. We're just happy to be invited. But in any case, it was just a stellar recognition of Nancy Pelosi and other Congresswomen and men's celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And so glad the Allentown Museum is keeping that spirit alive with this celebration.
Yes, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Gil, for the wonderful, Abigail, for the wonderful invitation.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, all the people in the audience, and of course, a very, very special thank you to our moderator, Claire McGree, and our three wonderful panelists, Dr. Cahill, Dr. Harley, and Dr. Ruiz. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your research and your experiences with us tonight. For anyone who's watching, if you haven't gotten the chance to see the exhibition, New Century, New Woman yet, it is now on view through April 18th. And we are also continuing our MLK celebration through Friday. We have an interactive dance workshop tomorrow night with the Philadelphia Dance Company, as well as another dynamic conversation on Thursday on the topic of museums and their role in fostering equitable and inclusive communities. For more information on the exhibition or on our MLK event, please visit our website at www.allentownartmuseum.org. And that's going to be it for us tonight. Thank you again to all of our panelists and all of our attendees. It's really been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night, y'all.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.